Richard Chen had everything money could buy. At 35, he'd built a technology company that changed how people worked around the world. His Manhattan penthouse overlooked Central Park. His garage held cars most people only saw in magazines. But none of that mattered anymore. Not after what the doctors told him. His wife, Catherine, sat beside him in the sterile hospital room, her hand gripping his so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The specialist, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, had just finished explaining their newborn twins' condition. The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Severe neurological disorder, paralysis from the waist down, unable to speak, unlikely to ever walk, unlikely to ever form words. Catherine made a sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite breathing, just a small broken noise that Richard would hear in his nightmares for years to come. The twins, a boy and a girl, lay in their incubators, tiny and perfect and utterly unaware that their lives had been measured and found wanting before they'd even really begun. Richard had always been a problem solver. It's how he'd made his fortune. But as he looked at his children through the clear plastic, watching their little chests rise and fall, he realized this wasn't a problem he could solve with money or intelligence or sheer determination. This was something else entirely. The next few months passed in a blur of medical consultations, experimental treatments, and sleepless nights. Catherine fell apart slowly, then all at once. She'd stop in the middle of changing the babies and just stare at the wall. She'd dress for charity galas and then refuse to leave the apartment. The friends who'd thrown her a lavish baby shower stopped calling after a while. Nobody knew what to say anymore. Richard dealt with it differently. He threw himself into research, contacting specialists in London, Tokyo, Boston. He donated millions to research centers studying neurological conditions in children. He attended conferences and read medical journals until his eyes burned. Anything to avoid sitting in that nursery, looking at his children and feeling completely powerless. They hired a nanny. Then another. Then another. 6 and 8 months. Each one came with impressive credentials and left exhausted, overwhelmed, or both. The twins required constant care. Feeding tubes, physical therapy exercises, medications administered on strict schedules. And through it all, they never cried out, never babbled like other babies. They just existed in their silent, still world. The 6th nanny quit on a Tuesday. Richard was in Tokyo for a business meeting when his house manager, Patricia, called him. She sounded tired. Patricia had been with them for 15 years and had never sounded tired before. "We need to try something different," Patricia said. "I have someone in mind. She's not like the others." Richard was too exhausted to argue. "Fine, whatever, just make sure the twins are cared for." Grace Thompson arrived the following Monday morning. She was 52, with warm brown skin and silver streaking through her black hair, which she wore pulled back in a simple bun. She carried a single worn leather bag and wore practical shoes. Everything about her was quiet, unremarkable even. Catherine barely glanced at her during their brief introduction. "These are the twins," Patricia said, leading Grace to the nursery. "Eleanor and Ethan, 3 months old. They require round-the-clock care. There's a manual on their therapy routines, medication schedules, and feeding protocols." The previous nanny left detailed notes. Grace walked to the crib slowly. She didn't pick up the manual. She didn't check the medication chart. She just stood there looking down at Eleanor and Ethan with an expression Patricia couldn't quite read. "Hello, little ones," Grace said softly. "I'm Grace. We're going to be spending a lot of time together." Eleanor's eyes, dark and serious, seemed to focus on Grace's face. Ethan's tiny hand opened and closed, opened and closed. "I'll leave you to review the materials," Patricia said, gesturing to the thick binder on the changing table. Grace nodded but didn't move to pick it up. After Patricia left, she pulled a chair close to the cribs and sat down. Then she began to hum. It was an old melody, something from her childhood in Georgia, passed down from her grandmother. She didn't know if the babies could hear her, didn't know if it mattered. She hummed anyway. Over the next few weeks, the household settled into a new rhythm. Grace moved through her duties with quiet efficiency. She never complained, never asked for time off, never seemed flustered by the twins' complex needs. Catherine, locked in her own grief, barely noticed. Richard, away more often than not, only knew that Patricia had stopped calling with crisis updates. What no one saw was what happened in that nursery when Grace was alone with Eleanor and Ethan. She talked to them constantly. Not baby talk, but real conversation. She told them about her day, about the weather, about the silly squirrel she'd seen in the park. She read to them from actual books, not just board books with simple pictures, but real stories with complicated plots and interesting characters. She touched them differently than the medical staff did. The physical therapists were efficient, professional, moving the baby's limbs through prescribed motions while checking boxes on their charts. Grace's touch was different. She'd gently massage Eleanor's legs while singing, her movements slow and deliberate. She'd trace patterns on Ethan's back, whispering stories about brave children who overcame impossible odds. At night, after Richard and Catherine had retreated to their separate corners of the penthouse, Grace would kneel beside the cribs. She'd pray, her voice barely audible, asking for strength and wisdom and healing. She'd learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be rushed or forced. Some miracles grew slowly in the dark where no one was watching. Grace had a daughter once. Her name was Michelle, born 28 years ago with cerebral palsy, given a similar prognosis to Eleanor and Ethan. The doctors had said Michelle would never walk, never live independently. Those doctors had been wrong. Michelle now taught dance classes to children with disabilities in Atlanta. Grace kept her photo in her wallet but hadn't told anyone in the Chen household about her. Some stories were private, at least for now. But late at night, talking softly to the sleeping twins, Grace would tell them about Michelle. About how everyone said it was impossible, but Michelle had learned to walk anyway. Not quickly, not easily, but she'd done it. How she'd learned to speak, though it took years longer than other children. How she'd graduated college and built a life that was full and meaningful and entirely her own. "You can do it too," Grace would whisper. "I know you can. You've got something special inside you just waiting to come out. We just have to find it together." She began keeping a small notebook hidden in her bag. In it, she recorded tiny observations. The way Eleanor's fingers would twitch when Grace sang certain songs. How Ethan's breathing would change when she read adventure stories versus quiet ones. The slight shift in Eleanor's expression when her mother's voice could be heard from the other room. Small things. Things the medical team would probably dismiss as meaningless. But Grace knew better. She'd seen these same small signs in Michelle decades ago. The body's way of fighting back, of refusing to accept the limitations placed on it. The spirit's insistence on being heard, even when the voice wouldn't work. 2 months in, on a random Thursday afternoon, something shifted. Grace was singing an old spiritual, one her grandmother used to hum while cooking. Eleanor's eyes locked onto Grace's face with sudden intensity. Her mouth opened slightly. And then, so quietly Grace almost missed it, a sound emerged. Not a word. Not even close. But intentional, purposeful, a response. Grace's heart stuttered in her chest. She kept singing, kept her expression calm, but inside she was screaming. She wanted to run and tell someone, wanted to shout it from the windows. Instead, she finished the song and gently stroked Eleanor's cheek. "That's my girl," she whispered. "That's my beautiful, strong girl. You keep trying. I'm right here." She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She knew how these things worked. If she said something too soon, they'd bring in more doctors, more tests, more strangers poking and prodding. They'd turn it into pressure and expectations. Right now, this was just between her and Eleanor. A small secret victory in a war nobody else knew they were fighting. Grace went back to her chair and picked up the book she'd been reading. A story about a garden that grew wild and beautiful when everyone thought it was dead. She read aloud, her voice steady and warm while Eleanor and Ethan listened in their own way. In another room, Catherine stared at her phone, unable to remember who she'd meant to call. In his office downtown, Richard reviewed contracts without really seeing them. The penthouse was quiet except for Grace's voice, reading about gardens and miracles and things everyone said were impossible. 4 months had passed since Grace arrived, and the penthouse had taken on an almost eerie quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that happens when people are living in the same space but inhabiting completely different worlds. Catherine spent most of her days in the master bedroom. Some mornings she'd wake up with plans to be present, to be the mother she'd imagined she'd be. She'd shower, put on makeup, walk determinedly toward the nursery. But then she'd hear Grace's voice through the door, soft and melodic, talking to the twins like they could understand every word. And something in Catherine would crack. She'd turn around and find herself back in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she couldn't be the person her children needed. Richard had become a ghost in his own home. He'd leave before dawn and return after midnight. His assistant kept asking if everything was okay. Of course, he'd say, just busy. In reality, he was terrified. Terrified of looking at Eleanor and Ethan and seeing his own failure reflected back. He could build companies, negotiate billion-dollar deals, speak to thousands without breaking a sweat. But he couldn't figure out how to be in a room with his own children without feeling like he was drowning. Grace noticed everything, said nothing. She'd seen families break under this kind of weight before. With Michelle, her own marriage hadn't survived. Her husband couldn't handle having a child who was different. He'd left when Michelle was 2, unable to bear the stares from strangers, the pitying looks from family. Grace had learned that you couldn't force people to be brave. They had to find it themselves. But the twins were responding in ways that made Grace's hands shake when she wrote in her notebook late at night. Eleanor had made that first sound 2 months ago. Now she was making sounds regularly. Different pitches, different tones. Grace had started associating certain songs with certain responses. A lullaby would make Eleanor's face relax, her breathing steady. An upbeat spiritual would cause her eyes to widen, her fingers to flex. It was communication. Crude, basic, but real. Ethan was different. He was quieter, more internal. But Grace had noticed that when she did specific massage patterns on his legs, following the muscle lines from hip to toe, his muscles would respond, tiny contractions, movements so small they'd be easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. The medical staff came twice a week for their therapy sessions and saw nothing unusual. They moved through their routines efficiently, professionally, and left without noticing the small war being waged in those tiny bodies. Grace had developed a routine. Mornings were for physical work. She'd warm her hands and gently massage Eleanor's legs, talking the whole time about what she was doing and why. She'd tell her about muscles and nerves and all the ways the body could surprise you. Then she'd move to Ethan, her touch firm but loving, singing songs with strong rhythms that seemed to resonate with something deep in his nervous system. Afternoons were for stories. Grace read everything. Adventure tales, mysteries, romances, histories. She'd do different voices for different characters, making the twins' eyes track her movements around the room. She'd pause dramatically at exciting parts, watching their faces for reactions. And she'd get them. A slight widening of Eleanor's eyes, a change in Ethan's breathing pattern. They were in there, locked inside bodies that wouldn't cooperate but desperately trying to engage with the world. Evenings were for music. Grace would sing, her voice filling the nursery. Sometimes she'd hold Eleanor and sway gently, feeling the baby's weight against her chest. Other times she'd lay Ethan on a soft mat and move his arms and legs in rhythm with the melody. She'd learned with Michelle that rhythm could sometimes reach parts of the brain that other things couldn't. That music could create pathways where none seemed to exist. One Tuesday, Patricia knocked on the nursery door. "Mrs. Chen wants to see you." Grace found Catherine in the living room, dressed for the first time in weeks, her hair styled, makeup perfect. She looked like the woman from the magazine profiles, except for her eyes. Her eyes looked lost. "I wanted to thank you," Catherine said, not quite meeting Grace's gaze, "for everything you're doing. Patricia says the twins are well cared for." "They're beautiful children," Grace said simply. Catherine's face twitched. "Are they? I don't know anymore. I look at them and I just see everything that's wrong. Everything that's broken. I know that makes me a terrible mother. It makes you human. The other mothers I know, the ones from my prenatal yoga class, they send me photos of their babies, rolling over, smiling, starting to sit up. Do you know what that's like? Seeing what your children should be doing and knowing they never will?" Grace sat down across from her. "My daughter has cerebral palsy." Catherine's head snapped up. "What? She's 28 now. Teaches dance in Atlanta. But when she was born, the doctor said she'd never walk. Never live independently. I spent 2 years believing them. 2 years of grief and anger and feeling like the universe had played a cruel joke on me." Grace's voice was steady, matter of fact. Then one day I realized I was grieving a child I'd imagined instead of loving the one I had. Changed everything. "But your daughter, she's okay now? She walks?" "She does. But that's not the point. The point is she was always okay. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy mourning who I thought she should be." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to do this. Start by spending time with them. Not doing therapy or following protocols. Just being with them. They know your voice. They need to know you're there. After Catherine left, Grace stood at the window looking out at the city lights. She'd said more than she usually did. Maybe too much. But something had to change in this house. These babies were fighting so hard to connect with a world that had already decided they couldn't. They needed their parents to fight too. That night, Grace was singing to Eleanor when the door opened softly. Catherine stood there in her pajamas looking uncertain, like she was entering a stranger's home. "Can I stay?" she asked quietly. Of course, Catherine sat in the chair Grace usually used. Grace brought Eleanor to her, placing the baby carefully in her mother's arms. Catherine held her stiffly at first, like she might break. But Grace started singing again, and slowly Catherine's body relaxed. "She's looking at me," Catherine whispered. "She always does when you're in the room. She knows you." A tear slid down Catherine's cheek. "I've been so awful. I've barely held them. I've been so angry at them for not being perfect, and they're just babies. They didn't choose this, neither did you. Grief isn't wrong. But at some point you have to decide whether you're going to stay in it or walk through it." Catherine stayed for an hour that night, then 2 hours the next night. By the end of the week, she was coming to the nursery every evening. Grace would show her the massage techniques, the songs that got the best responses. Catherine was clumsy at first, self-conscious, but the twins didn't care. They just soaked up her presence like flowers turning towards sun. One evening, Catherine was singing a song Grace had taught her, something soft and sweet. Eleanor's mouth opened and a sound came out, different from the ones she made with Grace, higher pitched, longer. Catherine stopped singing, her eyes wide. "Did she just—" "She did, because of me." "Because of my singing?" "Because you're her mother. Keep going." Catherine's voice shook as she continued, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor made the sound again. And again. Not words, not yet, but communication, connection. Proof that she was in there, trying desperately to reach back. That night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Grace found Richard standing outside the nursery door. "She didn't know how long he'd been there, I heard," he said. "Catherine told me. About Eleanor making sounds. She's been making them for a while now. Just small ones, but they're getting stronger. Why didn't anyone tell me? Would you have listened?" Richard flinched. "That's fair." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I see them?" Grace opened the door. The twins were sleeping, their faces peaceful in the dim light from the hallway. Richard stood over their cribs, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't know how to do this," he said, echoing his wife's words from days earlier. "I've spent my whole life being good at things. Building things, fixing things, but I can't fix this. They don't need fixing, the doctor said." "I know what the doctor said. I heard the same things about my daughter 28 years ago. But doctors see diagnoses. You need to see your children. What if I fail them? You already are. By not being here." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "These babies are fighting every single day to connect with this world. Eleanor is trying to use her voice even though her body makes it almost impossible. Ethan's muscles are responding to stimulation even though his nervous system is damaged. They're not giving up." "Why are you?" Richard's face crumpled. "I'm scared. I'm so scared. What if I love them and they still never get better? What if this is as good as it gets? What if you love them and that's enough? What if being their father isn't about making them walk or talk? What if it's just about being present?" Richard sank into the chair, his head in his hands. Grace left him there, sitting in the dark with his sleeping children, finally beginning to grieve not for the children he'd lost, but for the father he'd failed to be. The next morning, Grace arrived to find Richard already in the nursery. He looked like he hadn't slept. Eleanor was in his arms and he was reading to her from a business magazine. His voice was unsure, halting. "Morning," Grace said. "I didn't know what to read. This was in my briefcase." "It's perfect. She likes the sound of your voice. That's what matters." And so a new pattern began. Catherine came in the evenings. Richard came in the mornings before work, then again at night when he got home. They were clumsy, uncertain, but they were there. And the twins responded. Eleanor made more sounds. Ethan's muscle responses grew stronger. The family was finally beginning to function, not as they'd imagined, but as they actually were. Grace knew it was time. The twins had been making progress for months now, small gains that added up to something undeniable. Eleanor could make a dozen different sounds, each one purposeful and responsive. Ethan's legs showed muscle tone that the doctors had said would never develop. But Richard and Catherine still saw their children through the lens of that first devastating diagnosis. They needed to see what Grace saw. She requested a family meeting on a Sunday morning. Richard looked uncomfortable in casual clothes, like he didn't quite know what to do with himself when he wasn't in a suit. Catherine was anxious, twisting her wedding ring around and around. They sat in the living room while Grace brought out her notebook, the one she'd been keeping hidden for months. "I need to show you something," Grace said. She opened to the first page. "This is from Eleanor's second week with me. You'll see I noted that her right index finger twitched 3 times when I sang Amazing Grace. At the time, I thought it might be coincidence." She flipped through pages filled with careful observations. Dates, times, songs, responses. A map of 2 children fighting their way toward consciousness, toward connection, documented in Grace's precise handwriting. "This is from week 6. Ethan's calf muscle contracted when I massaged it following this specific pattern. It happened 14 times over 3 days. Not random, not reflexive, intentional." Richard leaned forward, his business mind engaging with the data. "You've been tracking all this? Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I needed to be sure. And because I needed you both to be ready to see it." Grace looked at Catherine. "You asked me once if I thought your children were broken. They're not. They're communicating. They're responding. They're here. You just have to learn their language." Catherine's hand went to her mouth. "Show me." They went to the nursery together. Grace positioned Catherine next to Eleanor's crib and handed her the notebook. "Page 47. See those songs listed? Sing any of them." Catherine's voice was shaky as she began singing a lullaby Grace had taught her weeks ago. Within seconds, Eleanor's eyes focused on her mother's face. Her mouth opened. A soft sound emerged, then another, rising and falling with the melody. "Oh my God," Catherine whispered. "She's singing with me." "She's actually singing with me." "Not with you," Grace said gently. "To you, this is her voice. It's different from other children's, but it's hers." Richard stood frozen, watching his daughter communicate in a way the doctors had said would be impossible. "What about Ethan?" Grace guided Richard's hands, showing him the massage pattern she'd developed. Firm pressure following the muscle line. "Watch his face." Richard's hands were clumsy at first, too tentative. But Grace adjusted his grip, his pressure, and suddenly Ethan's leg muscle contracted under his father's palm. Then again. Richard's breath caught. "He knows I'm here," Richard said, his voice breaking. "He knows it's me. He's always known. You just weren't looking for the signs." Grace left them there, parents finally connecting with their children, learning to read a language written in muscle twitches and wordless sounds. She went to make tea, giving them space for this small miracle she'd been cultivating in secret. But miracles, Grace knew, were rarely simple, and this one was about to get complicated. The next day, Catherine insisted on calling Dr. Morrison, the neurologist who'd given the original diagnosis. She wanted him to see what the twins could do. Grace felt a knot form in her stomach but said nothing. She understood the impulse. Catherine needed validation, needed an expert to confirm that what she was seeing was real. Dr. Morrison arrived that Thursday with 2 colleagues. They were professional, courteous, and deeply skeptical. Grace watched from the corner as they examined the twins, running through standard neurological tests while making notes on tablets. "Mrs. Chen tells us the children are showing unusual responses," Dr. Morrison said. "We'd like to document what you've observed." Grace demonstrated Eleanor's vocal responses to music. The doctors watched, made notes, but their expressions remained neutral. She showed them Ethan's muscle reactions to specific massage techniques. More notes, more neutral expressions. "Interesting," Dr. Morrison said, which Grace recognized as doctor speak for not convinced. "We'd like to run some tests. Updated scans, nerve conduction studies, developmental assessments. Will that help them?" Richard asked. "It will help us understand what's actually happening. These responses, while encouraging, may simply be reflexive. We need to rule out the possibility that you're seeing patterns where none exist." Grace felt Catherine stiffen beside her. The implication was clear. They thought it was wishful thinking. Desperate parents seeing miracles in random movements. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor and Ethan were subjected to a battery of tests. Specialists came and went, each one bringing machines and clipboards and carefully neutral expressions. The twins, overwhelmed by the parade of strangers and uncomfortable procedures, regressed. Eleanor stopped making sounds. Ethan's muscle responses diminished. Grace watched it happen with a sick feeling in her stomach. She'd seen this before with Michelle. The medical establishment, for all its good intentions, sometimes did more harm than good. They were so focused on measuring and categorizing that they forgot these were children, not puzzles to solve. Catherine was frantic. Why aren't they responding anymore? They were doing so well. Because they're scared, Grace said quietly. Too many new people. Too much stimulation. They need calm and consistency. But the doctors had a different interpretation. Dr. Morrison delivered his assessment in the same living room where Grace had shown Richard and Catherine her notebook. The scans show minimal change from the original diagnosis, he said. The twins' neurological condition remains severe. What you've been interpreting as intentional responses are likely reflexive movements and coincidental timing. I understand how much you want to see progress, but we have to be realistic about their prognosis. Catherine's face went white. But the sounds Eleanor makes, the way Ethan's muscles respond. You saw it. We saw movements. But movements without cognitive intent aren't communication. I'm sorry to be blunt, but giving yourselves false hope isn't helpful for anyone, least of all the children. Richard stood up, his jaw tight. So you're saying Grace has been imagining all of this? That we've been imagining it? I'm saying that parents of special needs children often develop very strong bonds and can interpret random responses as meaningful communication. It's understandable, but it's not based in medical reality. Grace remained silent. She'd learned long ago that arguing with doctors who'd made up their minds was pointless, but she watched Richard's face, saw something shift there. Get out, Richard said quietly. Dr. Morrison blinked. I'm sorry? Get out of my house, and take your colleagues with you. Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset, but no, you don't understand. You came into my home, put my children through weeks of invasive testing, stressed them to the point where they stopped responding, and now you're telling me that the progress we've witnessed with our own eyes doesn't exist. You're fired, all of you. After they left, Catherine collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing. What if they're right? What if we've been fooling ourselves? Richard sat beside her, took her hand. It was the first time Grace had seen them really touch in months. Do you believe what you saw? When Eleanor responded to your singing. Yes, but no buts. I felt Ethan's muscle move under my hand. I watched his face change when he recognized my touch. That wasn't reflexive. That was my son knowing his father. Richard's voice was fierce. The doctors see what their textbooks tell them to see. They can't see what's actually in front of them. Grace finally spoke. They're not wrong about everything. The twins do have significant neurological damage. They may never walk unassisted. They may never speak clearly. But they're in there, fighting to connect with this world. The question isn't whether the doctors believe it. The question is whether you do. That night, Grace returned to the nursery alone. Eleanor and Ethan were awake, their eyes tracking her movements. She sat between their cribs and began to sing, softly at first, then stronger. Eleanor's mouth opened. A sound emerged, tentative, as if testing whether it was safe to try again. That's right, baby girl, Grace murmured. You take your time. We've got nothing but time. She reached over to Ethan, began the massage pattern he responded to best. His leg muscle contracted once, twice. A smile played at the corner of his mouth. There you are, Grace whispered. Both of you. Right where you've always been. The next morning, Richard surprised everyone by not going to work. Instead, he came to the nursery and asked Grace to teach him everything. Not the medical protocols, not the therapy routines prescribed by the specialists who'd been fired. Grace's methods. Her songs, her massage patterns, her way of talking to the twins like they understood every word. I need to learn their language, Richard said. Will you teach me? Grace smiled. I thought you'd never ask. They spent hours together, Grace demonstrating while Richard practiced. His touch was still uncertain, his singing off-key, but the twins didn't care. They responded to his presence, to his effort, to the simple fact that he was finally truly there. Catherine joined them by midday. The three adults crowded into the nursery, learning together how to reach two children the world had already written off. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden breakthrough. Just slow, patient work. The kind of work that requires you to believe in something you can't quite see yet. By evening, Eleanor was making sounds again. Not as many as before the doctors came, but enough. Ethan's muscle responses had returned. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Grace stood by the window, watching the city lights come on. Richard and Catherine were both asleep in chairs beside the cribs, exhausted from the day's effort but refusing to leave. The twins were awake, their eyes bright in the dimness. "Your parents are fighting for you now," Grace told them softly. "Took them a while to figure out how, but they're here. And I promise you we're not stopping. We're not giving up." "Not ever," Eleanor made a sound. Ethan's fingers flexed. And in that moment, Grace knew they'd turned a corner. The hardest part wasn't the medical challenges ahead. It was getting everyone to believe that the impossible might just be possible after all. Everything was going well. Too well, perhaps. That should have been Grace's first warning. 3 months after Richard had fired the medical team, the twins were thriving in ways that defied their diagnosis. Eleanor could make over 30 distinct sounds, each one clearly intentional, clearly communicative. She'd rock her head back and forth when she wanted music, make a particular humming noise when she was hungry, go silent in a specific way when she was content. It wasn't speech, not in the traditional sense, but it was language. Ethan had developed his own vocabulary of movement. His legs showed muscle tone that grew stronger every week. He could curl his toes on command, contract his calf muscles when his parents sang to him, even manage tiny movements in his hips that the doctors had said would never happen. Grace had started incorporating more intensive physical work, carefully stretching his legs, building strength fraction by fraction. Richard had transformed. He'd stepped back from his company, promoting his second-in-command to acting CEO while he took a 6-month leave. He spent his days in the nursery, learning from Grace, working with his children. The man who'd once measured success in stock prices and profit margins now celebrated a muscle twitch like he'd won the lottery. Catherine had bloomed too. She'd started a private journal, documenting every small victory, every new sound, every response. She'd call Grace in the middle of the night sometimes, breathless with excitement because Eleanor had made a new noise she'd never heard before. The woman who'd spent months paralyzed by grief had found purpose in the slow, patient work of reaching her children. But success, Grace knew, always brought scrutiny. It started with a casual comment from Patricia, the house manager. "Mrs. Chen's mother called again. She's concerned that you've isolated yourselves from medical care." Grace had met Catherine's mother exactly once, a severe woman who'd suggested, politely but firmly, that perhaps the twins should be in a facility where professionals could care for them. Catherine had stopped taking her calls after that. "We haven't isolated ourselves," Catherine said defensively. "We're just doing what works for our children." But the seed was planted, and it grew. 2 weeks later, Dr. Morrison called, not to apologize or to check on the twins, to inform them that he'd filed a report with Child Protective Services expressing concern about the children's welfare. The twins, he claimed, were being denied appropriate medical care. Their parents had fired their entire medical team and were relying on unconventional methods provided by unqualified staff. Richard's face went purple when he got off the phone. He filed a CPS report. "That's sanctimonious. He's claiming we're neglecting our own children." Grace felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd seen this before, too. Well-meaning intervention that destroyed families trying to help their children in ways that didn't fit the standard medical model. "They're going to investigate," Richard continued, pacing. "They're going to send a social worker to evaluate whether Eleanor and Ethan are being properly cared for. And if they don't like what they see," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They all knew what could happen. The twins could be removed from the home, placed in foster care, put in a facility. Everything they'd built together could be ripped apart by people who'd never spent 5 minutes with Eleanor and Ethan, but had the power to decide what was best for them. Catherine was already crying. "How is this happening? They're our children. We're helping them. Anyone can see that. Anyone who's looking," Grace said quietly. "But they're not going to be looking. They're going to be measuring against protocols and standards. They're going to see that you fired your medical team and assumed the worst." The social worker arrived 3 days later. Her name was Beverly Santos, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd seen too much sadness in her career to be surprised by anything anymore. Grace watched from the doorway as Beverly examined the nursery, checked the medication logs, reviewed the feeding schedules. Everything was perfect. The twins were clean, well-fed. Their room was spotless. Their medical equipment properly maintained. "The concern," Beverly said, sitting down with Richard and Catherine in the living room, is that the children haven't been seen by a physician in 3 months. No follow-up neurological assessments, no physical therapy from licensed therapists, no updated treatment plans. Because the treatment they were receiving was making them worse, Richard said, struggling to keep his voice level. Our children were progressing until they were subjected to weeks of invasive testing that traumatized them. We made a decision to prioritize their well-being over medical protocols. I understand that medical intervention can be stressful, but these children have serious disabilities. They require expert care. They're getting expert care, Catherine said. Grace is a nanny, Beverly interrupted gently but firmly. Not a physical therapist. Not a speech therapist. Not a medical professional. What qualifications does she have to treat children with severe neurological disorders? The question hung in the air. Grace stepped forward from the doorway. I have 28 years of experience raising a daughter with cerebral palsy. I have no formal degrees, no licenses, just experience and love. Beverly looked at her with something like sympathy. I'm sure you've done your best. But these children need more than love. They need medical intervention. Can I show you something? Grace asked. Beverly nodded, and Grace led her to the nursery. Eleanor and Ethan were awake, watching with their serious, intelligent eyes as the stranger entered their space. Watch, Grace said softly. She began to sing. Within moments, Eleanor joined her, making her sounds in a pattern that rose and fell with the melody. Grace moved to Ethan, began her massage pattern, and his legs responded, muscles contracting visibly under her hands. What you're seeing is communication, Grace explained. It looks different from what you'd expect, but it's real. Eleanor tells us when she's hungry, when she's tired, when she wants to be held. Ethan responds to touch, to music, to his parents' voices. They're not empty vessels. They're children who are finding their way in the world. Beverly watched, her expression unreadable. When Grace finished, she made notes on her clipboard. It's clear they respond to stimuli. But I need to be honest with you. What I'm seeing doesn't constitute adequate medical care for children with their diagnosis. I'm required to recommend that they be evaluated by qualified medical professionals. And if we refuse? Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I have to consider whether you're acting in the best interest of your children. After Beverly left, Richard immediately called his lawyer. Catherine was too distraught to speak, just sat on the floor of the nursery holding Eleanor, rocking back and forth. Grace felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. This was her fault. If she'd kept the medical team involved, if she'd worked within the system instead of around it, maybe this wouldn't be happening. I should resign, Grace said that evening, finding Richard alone in his study. If I'm the problem, if my lack of credentials is what's putting the twins at risk. Don't, Richard said sharply. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. You're the only person who saw our children as human beings instead of diagnoses. The only one who believed they could communicate when everyone else had given up. You're not the problem. The system is the problem, but the system had power. And over the next week, that power made itself felt. Another social worker came, then another doctor for an independent evaluation. The twins, overwhelmed by the parade of strangers again, began to regress. Eleanor stopped making her sounds. Ethan's muscle responses diminished. The very thing Richard and Catherine were trying to protect their children from was happening anyway, forced on them by people claiming to act in the twins' best interest. Grace watched helplessly as the progress of months began to unravel. She tried to maintain the routines, the songs, the massage patterns, but the twins were shutting down, retreating into themselves the way they had in those first terrible months. One night, Grace found Catherine sitting in the dark nursery, Eleanor sleeping in her arms. They're going to take them away, Catherine whispered. Beverly called. She's recommending that Eleanor and Ethan be placed in a specialized care facility for evaluation. Temporarily, she says, but we both know what that means. When? Next week. Unless we agree to their terms. Full medical team. Regular evaluations. Supervised care. Catherine's voice broke. They're going to take my babies away from me because I love them in the wrong way. Grace sat down beside her, took her hand. She thought about Michelle, about all the times they'd faced this same choice. Conform or lose everything. Follow the protocols even when they weren't working or be labeled unfit. There might be another way, Grace said slowly. It's risky. But it might work, she explained her idea. It was audacious, maybe even foolish. But Catherine's eyes lit up with something like hope for the first time in days. The next morning, Richard made a call to his PR team, then another to every major news outlet in New York. By afternoon, reporters were arriving at the penthouse. By evening, the story was everywhere. Billionaire fights CPS over alternative care for disabled twins. Medical establishment threatens to remove children, showing unprecedented progress. Father asks, "Who decides what's best for my children?" Richard had bet everything on public opinion. He'd exposed his family's most private pain, his children's struggles, his own failures as a father. He sat for interview after interview, showing reporters Grace's notebooks, demonstrating Eleanor's responses, letting them see Ethan's muscle movements. "The doctor said my children would never communicate," Richard said to camera after camera. They were wrong. The doctors said they'd never show intentional movement. They were wrong. Now those same doctors want to take my children away because we found a way to reach them that doesn't fit their textbooks. Grace watched it unfold from the nursery, keeping Eleanor and Ethan calm, singing to them softly while their world exploded into media coverage. She didn't know if this would work. Publicity could go either way, but she knew Richard was right about one thing. Sometimes you had to fight the system with the only weapons you had. 2 days later, Dr. Morrison called again. His voice was tight, angry. "You've turned this into a circus. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've fought for my children," Richard said calmly. "What have you done?" The hearing was set for the following week. A judge would decide whether Eleanor and Ethan were being neglected, whether they should be removed from their home. Grace would have to testify. So would Catherine and Richard. So would the doctors who dismissed the twins' progress as impossible. The night before the hearing, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat in the nursery watching Eleanor and Ethan breathe, wondering if this would be one of her last nights with them. She'd fought this fight before with Michelle and won, but she'd also seen families lose. Seen children taken from parents who loved them because the love didn't look like what the authorities expected. "Please," she whispered into the darkness. "Please let them see. Let them see what I see. What their parents see. Let them see these babies fighting so hard to be here." Eleanor stirred, made a soft sound. Ethan's fingers flexed. And Grace held on to that small response like a lifeline. Proof that miracles were real even when the whole world said they weren't. The courtroom was nothing like the ones you see on television. It was smaller, quieter, with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Eleanor and Ethan weren't there. They were at home with Patricia, blissfully unaware that a stranger in a black robe was about to decide their fate. Judge Maria Brennan was in her 60s, with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she kept adjusting as she reviewed the case files. Grace watched her face for any hint of what she was thinking and found nothing. The judge's expression was carefully neutral, professionally distant. Dr. Morrison was the first to testify. He was calm, authoritative, laying out the twins' diagnosis with clinical precision: severe neurological disorder, profound developmental delays, paralysis, nonverbal. He showed scans, test results, documentation of abnormalities. "These children require intensive medical intervention," he concluded. "Instead, their parents have isolated them from qualified care and placed them under the supervision of someone with no medical training whatsoever. In my professional opinion, this constitutes medical neglect." Richard's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Park, stood for cross-examination. "Dr. Morrison, in your testimony, you stated that Eleanor and Ethan would likely never communicate or show intentional movement. Is that correct?" "Based on their diagnosis, yes." "And if they were showing such responses? If they were, for example, making sounds in response to specific stimuli, or demonstrating controlled muscle movements, would that change your prognosis?" Dr. Morrison shifted slightly. "Reflexive responses are common in patients with neurological damage. They don't indicate cognitive function. I didn't ask about reflexive responses. I asked about intentional communication. There's no evidence of intentional communication. What the parents are interpreting as communication is wishful thinking." Jennifer smiled, the kind of smile that meant she was about to spring a trap. "We'll come back to that," Beverly Santos testified next. She was sympathetic but firm. The twins needed qualified medical care. The parents had refused to follow medical advice. Grace's methods, while clearly well-intentioned, didn't meet professional standards. But you observed the twins responding to Ms. Thompson's interventions, didn't you? Jennifer asked. I observed responses to stimuli, but I'm not qualified to assess whether those responses indicate cognitive awareness or are simply reflexive. Who would be qualified to make that assessment? A neurologist, a developmental pediatrician, a licensed therapist, thank you. No further questions. When it was Richard's turn, he walked to the stand with his shoulders straight, but Grace could see the tremor in his hands. He told the story of the past year, the devastating diagnosis, the months of despair, the parade of nannies, Grace's arrival, the first small signs of response, the growing evidence that his children were in there, aware, trying to communicate. Dr. Morrison is right about one thing, Richard said. I'm not a medical professional. Neither is my wife. We're just parents who love our children and want what's best for them. But here's what I know. When Grace came into our lives, my children were existing, not living. They were being maintained according to protocols, but nobody was reaching them. Grace reached them. She saw them as human beings, not diagnoses, and they responded. But Mr. Chen, the opposing counsel asked during cross-examination, don't you think that qualified medical professionals would know better than a nanny how to care for children with such severe disabilities? I thought that, Richard said quietly. For months I thought that. I threw money at the best specialists in the world. And you know what they gave me? Pity, statistics, reasons to give up hope. Grace gave me something different. She gave me back my children. Catherine testified through tears. She talked about the depression, the grief, the months where she couldn't even look at her own children because seeing them hurt too much. And then she talked about the evening when Eleanor had made sounds while she sang, when she'd felt for the first time, like a real mother to her daughter. They told me to accept my children's limitations, Catherine said. Grace taught me to see their possibilities instead. But the most important testimony came last. Grace walked to the stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her. She'd dressed carefully that morning, trying to look professional, credible, worthy of the trust Richard and Catherine had placed in her. The opposing counsel wasted no time. Ms. Thompson, what are your professional qualifications? I have a high school diploma. I've worked as a nanny and childcare provider for 30 years. No medical training? No. No degree in physical therapy, speech therapy, or any developmental specialty? No. So on what basis do you believe you're qualified to treat children with severe neurological disorders? Grace took a breath. This was it. The moment everything depended on the basis that I raised a daughter with cerebral palsy. The doctors said she'd never walk. She walks. They said she'd never live independently. She has her own apartment and teaches dance to children with disabilities. They said she'd need institutional care. She graduated college with honors. That's one case, an anecdote. It's my life. It's my daughter's life. And yes, it's one case, but it taught me something the medical textbooks don't always get right. Diagnosis isn't destiny. Love matters. Belief matters. Treating children as whole people matters. But surely you understand that your methods, however well-intentioned, can't replace qualified medical care. I never said they could. But I'm not replacing medical care. I'm providing what medical care alone can't give. Connection, patience, the absolute certainty that these children are worth every minute of effort, every failed attempt, every tiny victory. Jennifer Park stood for redirect. Ms. Thompson, can you demonstrate what you've been doing with Eleanor and Ethan?